my name is Nikki Gurley. I work with a global health NGO in Seattle called PATH. We work in a number of areas: vaccine development, health system strengthening. I specifically work on our evaluation team, which basically serves any number of initiatives and projects across the organization. One of my particular areas of interest and how I ended up here today is the use of data, and specifically how can we equip people with the tools to take control of their own data and use it to tell their own stories. So making it really participatory, inclusive, and user-driven. So that's a big part of why I'm excited about data visualization and thinking about how it can be used to make data more accessible and usable. So let's dive in. We are going to start today with just a brief land recognition that, at least for those of us in Seattle, we are gathering today on the ancestral land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish. And this acknowledgement is one small step against the erasure of our Native communities. So in addition to the Duwamish, King County is home to the traditional lands of the Muckleshoot, Snoqualmie, and Tulalip tribes, as well as other Coast Salish people. So acknowledging that King County is home to a vibrant and diverse community of Indigenous people from across North America and beyond. So we will now dive into just quickly talking about sort of what this workshop is building. As Chris noted, this is part of a Communities of Opportunity series. Recent other data visualization trainings have included storytelling with data. However, this workshop today is meant to be standalone. It's not, it doesn't require that you've attended the other ones. That being said, if you miss storytelling with data and you would like to participate in it, there will be a repeat as well as other forthcoming workshops. So, for those of you who saw the introduction screen, there was a question on there about what is something you hope to learn from today's workshop. We'd love to just briefly hear either in chat or on audio, what's something you're hoping to gain from today's session? Great. Learn about some of the tools used. Yep, great. Some ways to visually present data. Storytelling, yep. Not reinventing the wheel every time. Ideas from examples of other work. Great. Great. Well, I think the good news is we all hopefully will have something for everyone, hopefully, based on the answers I'm seeing. How to effectively tell stories visually. Great. Oh, I like this. How to tell stories accurately and consumer friendly. Perfect. Thank you, Carol. Great. So I think all of you have mentioned things that we're going to be covering in the workshop today, but just a sort of a quick recap of our objective. Ultimately, the goal of this workshop is really to introduce some of the basic principles of how to effectively visualize data and what are some of the charts, graphics, maps that we can use to do that. We're going to explore some considerations for that, how to make it accessible, how to ensure your data visualizations are easy to understand, how they're clear, and we will have a number of examples and sort of comparisons throughout. I will say what we're not going to get into is sort of like the how to recreate these in Excel. There's a bunch of resources in the slide about where can you go for further instruction on that, but we're not going to do anything hands-on with Excel or Tableau or Google Sheets today. So just clarifying that. Great. So we're going to dive in, and this is sort of a quick roadmap of where we're going today. So we're going to start by talking about why should you visualize your data and why is it important. And then we're going to spend the bulk of our session talking through a framework for data visualization that I like to use. And you can see that the 4 components that we're going to cover are the purpose of a visualization, the content, the structure, and the formatting. We'll sort of tie it all together at the end by talking about how can you take this forward and what tools can you use yourself to apply this, as well as sort of a quick case study of what this looks like from end to end. Great. So we're going to start with sort of the beginning piece of why do we want to visualize our data in the first place? What is important about it and why would we want to do this? And I like to use this graphic to show that there's a lot of data out in our world, right? Whether it's traditional census data, interviews, photos, and at times it can feel overwhelming, right? It feels like you're being bombarded with all these papers or all these numbers. And that's one of the challenges here, right? Is how do we make sense of it all and how do we make it manageable? And one of the examples that I like from global health that has talked about why is this important is that oftentimes when there's so much data or when it's not accessible, we rely on our biases and preconceived ideas. So one of the pioneers of data visualization in global health, Hans Rosling, would frequently survey people on what they thought about the state of global health. And even though the data was widely available and these people were very well versed in the field, they often sort of put the data to the side and fell back on these stereotypes, right? So to his point, it wasn't that the information wasn't there, but it was that people relied on these preconceived notions of what they thought the world should be like. And so for me, this sort of speaks to the fact that the issue isn't necessarily that we don't have the data or it's not there. It's that when it's too overwhelming or difficult for us to process, we don't use it, right? And so that's where I see data visualization having a really key role to play, right? It makes the data more accessible and digestible, and it allows us to really take control of the narrative and to share our information in a way that's meaningful and valuable. So here's some ideas of what a visualization can do. I think at the very beginning, we have tell a story, which I know multiple people mentioned as something they're interested in, is figuring out how to tell these stories. And then a lot of this is also making sense of those large amounts of data, right? So summarizing large quantities of data, highlighting relationships, and then this piece at the end, informing decision-making. I think this is a really key one to call out. And the example I like to use is, if we have data about community needs, we want to be able to use that data to inform a decision about what programs we offer, right? So that's sort of why are we talking about this today, right? Why data visualization? Where we're going to now focus is the visualization piece, right? So how are we going to do this and what are we doing with it? And to do this, we're going to start by talking about a framework for visualization. So the framework that I like to use is what I call the 4 pillars of data visualization. And we've adapted this from a sort of a prior graphic, and we're going to start on our bottom. So we're going to start with our foundation here, which is our audience. And I think when you're developing a visual, this is a really key piece to keep in mind, right? So who are you creating your visualization for? And what do they need to know, right? What's important to them and how are they going to use this? We then have our 4 pillars, and you can see from left to right, we're going to start with purpose. And this is very much the why of our visual. We're then going to talk about content, the structure, and the formatting. So we're going to do a deep dive into each of these. And just as sort of like a quick cheat sheet, when I think about the 4 pillars of our framework, I often think about these questions, right? So when I talk about purpose, what I'm really asking is, why am I creating this visual? What's important about it? For content, what I'm asking is really, what data am I using? And more importantly, what's important within that data, right? Are there specific things that are really valuable? For structure, I'm thinking about how can we best present our data? And we'll talk a lot about this, but this is about like what chart type should we use or what's easiest for people to understand. Formatting is all of the sort of extra elements that make our graphics accessible and also nice looking. And then again, we have this foundational element, right, which underpins all of this, which is who is our user and what do they need? What's important to them? So before we dive in, since our audience is our foundation, what I'd love to hear from you in the chat or on audio, please feel free to unmute, is who are some of the audiences that you see for your possible data visualizations? Are there people that you would imagine making a visual for or that you'd want to disseminate your information to? Funders, yep, a key one, always. Donors, yep. Clients, yeah, I think that's a good call out, right? Community members and constituents, yeah. CEO, public awareness, yeah. Community stakeholders, great. Yeah. Yeah, so there's a whole range of uses and audiences here, right? I'm seeing some that are external focused. So donors, maybe political officials, legislators, yep. Community members or the participants of programs. Some are internal, right? It might be people within your team, your staff, commissioners. Great. Perfect. This is helpful to see. So as we go through this today, I want you to sort of keep your audience in mind and think about what would they need or what would be their use, right? And they're going to underpin sort of the next 4 pieces that we talk through. So we're going to start with purpose. And this is really that question of why are you making this visual, right? What's the importance of this visual? And the way that I think about this is at the beginning, I want to define what my question is. What is the question that I really want to answer with this visualization? Some things that I sometimes consider when I'm trying to identify my question is first and foremost, again, what's my audience need to know, right? Maybe they need to be made aware of inequities in school suspensions. Other questions that you consider might be more internally facing. So a few people said, partners or staff members. So maybe you want to know what your organization needs to do to develop or improve services, right? Sometimes your questions are also going to be sort of more evident or identified for you, right? So it might be that there already is a key question of interest because the donor has a requirement that you report on a specific thing, right? And the reason that we start with our question is because ultimately the goal of our visual is going to be to answer that question, right? So you can think of your question is the purpose of your visual, and your visualization is ultimately going to be the answer to that question. An example of this is that, say for instance, the state has a bucket of funds for math improvement that they need to allocate. To ensure that they're going to the places with the greatest need, we want to know which school district had the fewest number of students who met math standards in 2019. That's our question, which school district, right? And what you can see is that here, we've created a visual that helps to answer that question, right? Each district has a bar, and it shows the performance of each district. And you can see that they're ranked right now from high to low. So we can clearly see on the right-hand side that this chart is giving us the answer to that question, right? Federal Way had the fewest number of students meeting standards. That answers our question and tells us where to allocate those funds. So this is why we start with our purpose, is to think about what is that question. There's a ton of possible purposes for a visual, right? So there's no singular right answer here. It really depends on what is your question, what's your audience need, and what are you trying to present. But we're going to talk through 4 very common purposes that we see in visualizations, and these will sort of tie together the rest of our presentation. So a common one is comparing 2 or more groups, right? So you can think of this would be something like, what's the difference between 2 groups of people within the population? Another one is showing how things changed over time. I think a common one here is, how has my program changed performance, right? Are people having better access to services because of the result of my program? Another common one is understanding the parts of the whole. And so this is understanding sort of within a group, what's the sentiment? So for instance, amongst our organization staff, how do people feel the board of directors is performing? The last one that we frequently see is the comparison of different geographic areas, right? So for instance, in King County, maybe we want to understand what's the difference between 2 zip codes or 2 communities. One thing you'll notice is that there isn't really a why question here. It can sometimes be hard to capture a really detailed explanation in a visual, right? To understand why did something happen. And so this is a moment where giving appropriate context to your audience, whether it's in a presentation or in supporting text or even in a footnote, can be really helpful for them to understand why are they seeing what they're seeing, right? Why is there a difference between these 2 groups? Great. So once we sort of define our question, the next piece we're gonna really want to think about is our content. And our content fundamentally is what data is going to go into the visualization. So this could be a survey, it could be an interview, it could be an existing data source like the census, right? Communities Count website has a great data toolbox, which has some existing data sources that you can use. And this is another area where the King County Public Health team is a great resource. So the first thing we want to talk about when we talk about content is prioritizing what goes into our visual. And, you know, when I think about this, what I frequently come down to is we don't always need all of the information to answer our question, right? We normally need a very specific piece of information. And we talked at the beginning about how with so much data available, we can end up overwhelmed, right? We can end up in that storm of papers. And when we pick our content, we want to be selective. We don't let our viewers get overwhelmed again, right? So we want to avoid the kitchen sink approach. The flip side of this, though, is that we also want to be honest. I'm sure many of you have heard the adage that statistics will say anything you want them to, right? And so when we select our content, we do want to prioritize what's important, but we also don't want to manipulate our viewers, right? Yeah, there's a great chat in the box, quality over quantity. And I just want to give a quick example of what I say when I say manipulate our viewers, right? So this example of COVID cases in King County, this looks like they're pretty flat, like they're leveling off, things are great. However, what we can see is that this graph, which is the exact same data, gives a much different portrait, right? You can see there's actually a pretty significant upward trend. There was a big increase in March and April. And the only thing that I changed here was the time period, right? The data is otherwise entirely the same. The graphics are even the same type. And so when we think about curating our content and picking that high quality data to answer our question, we also want to be careful that we're being honest, right? An important case study about this that I want to highlight is the consideration of equity when we choose our content as well. So for instance, this is the map of the US we most frequently see, right? Everyone's familiar with this. What if we use this map instead though? This map shows indigenous territories in the US. It's again, fundamentally the same data, it's the same geography, but the content we're choosing here tells our readers a specific story or a specific worldview. So when we think about choosing our content, we want to think about prioritizing what's important and being honest, but it's also important to be reflective about what story is our content upholding. You know, are we selecting content or data that reinforces either harmful messages or harmful stereotypes? And is there important historical context that's missing, right? It's not necessarily, you know, the data is what we make of it to a certain degree. So when we choose our content, we want to be careful about picking the right data to answer our question and also something that is reflecting the story we want to tell. Great. So we've talked a bit about what is the question we're trying to answer, how do we select our data to answer that question, and we're going to spend a bunch of the rest of our time talking about structure. So what I say when I mean structure is really thinking about how we decide which visuals to use and which visuals are going to be the easiest. Since we're really thinking about this as telling a story to answer a question, we really want to point people to what we want them to see in a visual, right? We want to make it easy for them. We don't want them to have to dig through all of that information again. So to start with, we're going to do a very quick example. And I want you to imagine that my question here is how many 9s are in this visual. I'm going to put this up for literally 10 seconds, but I want you to look at this and think about if you had to answer this question of how many 9s there were, would it be easy to answer? I think no, but what about now? This again is the same data, it's the same information, but it's a lot easier to get the answer to that question, right? I can look at this and I can say, oh, there's 5 of them. And so this is really just to show how the structure of our visual matters because it determines how easily people will be able to understand and identify that answer, right? Ideally, when we have our visual, you know, I should be able to look at this and quickly see sort of the same key point that everyone else is seeing here too. So to talk about structure, I first want to talk about the difference between these two and why one is easier to understand than the other. So as I said, I would argue that visual A is easier to understand. Again, it's fundamentally the same content, but the structure of how we presented it is different, right? We added these color blocks here on A to help make it easier to see. And The reason that A is easier to see is because it fundamentally takes advantage of how our brains process information. And what I mean when I say that is really the brain can only absorb so much information at once, right? But humans are very visual creatures, and we innately recognize patterns through what are called pre-attentive attributes. And pre-attentive attributes are essentially visual clues that tell our mind, look here, right? Pay attention to this one important thing. So for instance, as we saw on the last slide, color is a visual clue, right? We have two colors here, and you can see immediately that your eye is drawn to that red dot. It notices that there's fundamentally a difference between the black dots and the red dots, because that red dot doesn't fit that pattern, right? It doesn't fit into sort of the rest of the grid. So when we do our visuals, we want to think about what sort of visual clues we can use to help people understand the story we're telling. I'm going to talk through a few other examples of visual clues, and then what we're going to do is look at how these apply to charts and where they fit in. So a common visual clue we see is length, right? When one thing is longer than another. This is frequently why bar charts work so well, because you can look at the length and you can immediately see, oh, there's a difference between these lengths. Another one is orientation, right? When something's heading in a different direction than other lines. For instance, this is why line graphs tend to work so well, because you can see immediately and understand, is something going up or is something going down? Another common one is position, right? If we have three things in a row and something out of line, we can immediately tell where it is as well. Another common one is size, something bigger than another. I think a lot of people experience this or see this with maps, right? You can look at it and have a judgment of, you know, which state is bigger than another, which area is bigger than another. And then lastly, we have shape, right? Things with different shapes. So, great. So one thing of note here is that there are other visual clues. And the link below actually has a great resource for some of the other ones. We're going to focus on these for the graphs that we're looking at today, as these are some of the most common. So the one thing I want to note is there's only so much the mind can process. So we want to be careful of not overusing our visual clues, right? So if we go back to that number grid, right? If we color code every single number in the grid, we end up back in that overwhelmed situation that we talked about at the beginning, where there's too much happening, it's too hard to process, we can't actually answer our question. And so we want to avoid using too many visual clues and instead focus on highlighting what are the important pieces to us, right? What's most important for us to know. So instead of this, you know, sort of I spy situation, we want to go back to our chart here where we just have the 9s highlighted to answer our question. What does this mean for chart structure? So we've sort of talked about these visual clues and the importance of pattern recognition. And the reason we're talking about this is because these visual clues and this sort of pattern recognition science helps us to determine what the structure of our visual should be. So really, oftentimes, depending on what type of question we have, right, or what our purpose is, different visual clues are going to help us reveal those patterns more easily than others. The good news is we don't have to figure this out or reinvent the wheel every time. A lot of people have already done this work of figuring out what sort of questions are best answered by different chart types. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk through a little bit of that now and talk through some of those chart types. So we're going to go back to our 4 purposes we identified at the beginning. And you can see on the right-hand side, there's a few chart types that are highlighted for each as being good at answering those questions based upon the visual clues they use. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a deep dive into one of each of these. So for comparing 2 or more groups, we're going to do a deep dive into bar charts. For showing how things change over time, you can see there's a few different options: line graphs, bar charts again, Gantt bars. We're going to do a deep dive into line graphs today. For understanding the parts of the whole, we're going to do a deep dive into pie charts, but we can also think about stacked bar charts or tree maps. And then lastly, comparing different geographic areas. We're going to do a deep dive into what we call a choropleth, which is literally just a shaded in map. So We're going to deep dive into each of these, and you can see that I actually added a bonus one at the end, which is text tables, because those are a visual element, as we saw with the grid of nines, right? It's just a table of text, but it's still visual. And what I'd say here is, you know, this is a sample of different visuals. These are not the only visuals out there. There's dozens more visuals. Some of these visuals may be new to you, some might not. Most of these were selected in part because they can be done pretty easily in readily available softwares, which we'll talk about at the end, right? So these are doable in Excel or Google Sheets. And this is an area as well where the King County Public Health team can really provide support also. You know, if you know that you want to create a certain chart but are struggling with implementing it, they provide technical assistance that can speak to that. All right, we're going to start with our first chart type. So we're going to start with bar charts. And in this bar chart here, so this was pulled from the King County website, the goal here is to show the differences in life expectancies among different racial groups in King County. And so we're just going to talk through this real quick. You can see that each bar represents one group, right? So in green, we have Asian, Hispanic, and this uses a few different visual clues. So the first one it uses is length, right? So the distance between the bottom of the bar to the top of the bar, that's length, and cues us into what's the life expectancy. It's also using the visual clue of position. So what is the endpoint of the bar, right? So you can see the endpoint of the bar up here is just under 90, and that similarly clues us into the range of life expectancies here. You can see that this group also has added color. And they've used color here to differ between the different groups, right? So this in general is a bar chart is good for showing comparisons or for showing rankings because of the fact that our mind can really easily pull out these visual clues of length and position, right? We can pretty easily understand, oh, you know, the top bar goes just under 90, whereas the bottom bar here with American Indians, Alaskan Natives is just above 70. And we can understand pretty quickly like which group has the highest life expectancy and which group has the lowest life expectancy. So bar charts are great for showing comparisons. One thing I want to highlight here again is you'll note that this question and the answer doesn't really talk about why are there disparities in life expectancy, right? It just shows us what are the disparities and where do they exist. This is another why question that might be hard to answer in a visual and would benefit from a footnote or a text box which explains those structural factors which have led to disparate health outcomes, right? And that talks about why is it that those life expectancies are different. So, great. So now that we've talked about the upsides of bar charts, I want to quickly call out what is a common challenge with bar charts and what are some of the tips and tricks to overcome that. So one challenge with bar charts is that if you have a lot of bars, it's not always clear to know where you should look or what the pattern is, right? So for instance, in this chart of unemployment claims in King County by industry, it's not immediately evident which is highest and lowest, right? We look at the top and accommodation and food services up top, and it is a very long bar, but we then have to look down here to arts, entertainment, and recreation to see, is this one bigger or is this one smaller? One thing we can do to help alleviate that is we can sort our bar charts, right? So if you sort your data so the largest values are on the top and the smallest values are on the bottom, it makes it easier to see those patterns, right? We can immediately say, oh, accommodation and food services is the highest number of initial claims, and then our lowest is down here in mining and utilities, right? So that's sort of an easy way to enhance the visibility of your graphic. We're next going to talk about line charts. So as we sort of mentioned earlier, line graphs are most commonly used for a change over time. And what that means is you'll almost always see a date on the horizontal axis here. In this line graph, the goal is to show how traffic has changed in King County during the COVID outbreak. And we're actually using 3 visual clues here. So the first one is position, right? So where is the dot for each day? The second one is length. So what is the length of the line between the days, right? The distance. And then the last one, and arguably the most important for this graph, is orientation, right? And so orientation here is the visual clue which tells us, is something going up or is it going down? Orientation is what can help us understand, like, oh, before March 16th, the line's decreasing. And then after March 16th, we start to see these slow increases, right? And because of this orientation element is what makes line charts so well suited to showing changes in time. Line graphs are probably honestly like the only thing I use for showing changes over time. So they're a great option for that. One other thing to note is that they have added colors again here to differentiate between the different types, right? So they added a visual clue of color to show that highway traffic is different from toll trips, is different from ferry ridership. So color is almost always another visual clue that you can add. It's just a question of what is your question and does it help answer it? A key challenge that I want to call out with line graphs is the scale. And this really goes back to our question of content and making sure that we're not being misleading, right? So not letting our visuals lie. So you can see here that we had a chart where the range was really 0 to 100, right? It was a percentage. The most it could be was 100, the least it could be was 0. On the left, I artificially constrained it to be between 30 and 50%. And the result is that it looks like there's these really enormous jumps, right? These big peaks and these big mountains. On the other side, over here though, on the right, I've made the scale artificially large, right? It runs from 0 to 200%, and so it looks really flat. And this is an important part with a line graph, is being careful to use a scale that shows the data in a meaningful and honest way, right? Here, really my scale probably should have been 0 to 100 because that's really what the range was. So a key limitation with line graphs. We're going to talk about pie charts. Great. And so pie charts are one of the first chart types that most people learn. And I should add a caveat here that I've actually cheated a little bit. Technically, the chart that I'm showing here is called a donut chart, which is the same thing as a pie chart, but with a hole in the middle. So could call it a bagel chart if you want, or any other food with a hole in the center. But fundamentally, the idea is the same. And in this graphic, we want to know, among the people accessing homelessness services in King County, how many are veterans? And pie charts are great for answering a question. Oops, sorry. I just got a preview of the next two slides. Pie charts are great for answering a question like this because fundamentally what they do is they show the parts of a whole, the distribution within a group. And to do that, they use two visual clues. So one is, again, the orientation, right? So what's the angle of the slice here? The other visual clue that they use is size. So how large is each portion of the pie, right? We can look at this and say, oh, the green section of the pie is much larger than the orange section. One challenge with these is that it can often be hard to tell exact numbers when you only use orientation and size, right? So looking at this, I don't know that I would be able to guess that the veterans group was 9% if I didn't have that label. And that's okay. That just might mean that we need to add that text. So otherwise, it's good for showing us the parts of the whole, and it answers our question of how many people accessing homelessness services are veterans in King County. A key challenge with pie charts is too many slices, right? If we have 30 slices of pie, it's hard to know what each of those slices are, right? It brings us back into that place of data overwhelm where we don't really know what those 30 slices mean or what the pattern is or what the difference is. So in general, with a pie chart, you want to stay with fewer slices, right? You probably want to stay with like 2, 3, 4, maybe 5. Try it out and you'll get a sense of when is too many slices. So the next graphic we're going to talk about today is a choropleth. And as I said earlier, a choropleth is really just a fancy name for a shaded map, right? So you can see in this graphic, we want to know which communities in King County have a greater proportion of people age 60 plus. And you can see on the map here that really the only visual clue we're using is color, right? We have our gradient down here, which goes from light to dark, and that tells us how many people live in each geographic area, right? The benefit of these, of course, is that they're really good at showing data by geographic place, right? So where is something geographically? What are the community boundaries? Where is it relative geographically to other places? The challenge with maps is often that it can be hard to compare things on a map, right? Nope, and we have an extra legend there, apologies. So for instance, say we want to know specifically, the communities in Seattle with the highest number of people over age 60. I can look at this and I can say, okay, it's one of these dark purple ones up here, maybe this other dark purple one, but I don't know the exact numbers, right? It's hard for me to say what is the specific number. So if you want a specific comparison, you might want to think about using a different chart type. For instance, one that uses length or position, like a bar chart or a dot plot, which is this one here. And a dot plot, like we're showing here, is really just a cousin of a bar chart. You can see that this shows us the specific numbers, and it highlights really clearly that the neighborhoods with the highest number of people are going to be downtown, West Seattle, and Shoreline. And I think to that end, when you're using a map, it's important to think about what is the meaning of place, right? Is place meaningful in answering your question? So for instance, if we were thinking about air pollution, place is often going to be very meaningful because the location of specific geographies, proximity to industrial sites, or other pollution factors is going to be really important in showing our findings, right? The geographic distance is meaningful. But I think that's a key consideration with maps, is what is the meaning of place, and is a map the right option for showing it if not. The last one we're going to talk about is text tables, and I think we oftentimes don't think of these as visuals because we see them so often in reports. They feel very text heavy, and they are, but they are a visual, and I want to talk about how we can strengthen them. So they're really ultimately best at showing exact values. For instance, with this purpose here, right? The New York Times was trying to show how many COVID cases and deaths are there in every single municipality in the US. This text table gives us all of those exact values for all of those geographies, right? And you can scroll through and see specifically Gallup, New Mexico had 519 cases. The challenge with a text table, though, is that they don't naturally use any of our visual clues, right? They don't typically use things like length or size to tell us what's the most important thing in the table. So we have to sort through the table to really understand what's there. What we can do, though, is we can add visual clues that help make it easier for people to interpret. So for instance, the New York Times here added a visual clue of color, right? They added a color scheme where darkest was the highest number of cases and lighter was fewer number of cases, right? And so adding that color scheme helps us to understand, where should I look to see the places with the most number of cases? The other thing that they did is they added the visual clue of position. And what I mean when I say that is they sorted the data. So now the geography that has the highest number of cases is now sorted to be in the top position, right? It's in the number 1 position. And so this position of high to low helps us again understand what's the relative meaning. So if you're using a text table, that's one thing to think about is, can you add color or can you sort your data in some way to make it easier to interpret, right? Easier for people to see. One of the key limitations here with text tables is just that it's hard to see a relationship between two things, right? So for instance, we have this table of text here. There's a bunch of numbers. Some of them are sorted, but it's not really clear what the meaning is. If we graph those same numbers on a scatter plot, we can start to see a pattern, right? One of them has a straight upward line, one of them has a curve, one of them straight up and down. And this again is the same content, right? It's the same data. And so one of the key challenges with a text table is if you know that there's a relationship that's important, right? That one thing is linked with another, you probably want an actual chart, right? You probably don't want a text table because it's going to be really hard for people to understand that relationship between two different things. Great. The last chart type I want to talk about, and this is sort of a bonus, and that it's not really a chart as much as it is a strategy for multiple charts, are what we call small multiples. So a small multiple is fundamentally just taking panels of the same graphic type and using it side by side. So for instance, you can see here again, right? We have one line graph, and the line graph is just repeated over and over for each group, right? So we have one line graph for Hispanic Latinx, we have one for American Indian Alaska Native, so on and so forth. And this could be any graphic type, right? So it could be any of the ones we've talked about. It could be a bar chart, it could be a line graph, it could be anything you imagine. The small multiples piece is really just that we're taking a bunch of them and putting them side by side. And the reason that this is useful is they're really good for showing large amounts of similar information, right? So for instance, here in this visual, we wanted to look at what was the change in uninsured adults by racial group from 2013 to 2017. That's a lot of data, but it's all very similar, right? It's all going to be uninsured adults between 2013 and 2017. And the data is going to look the same for each group, right? Then the only thing that's going to change between each group is the numbers. And so what we did is we just gave each group their own graph, their own Mancher line graph, and then put them side by side to see all those trends together. The great thing about this is that for your user, they only have to understand one of these graphs to then understand all of them, right? Once I look at this and interpret the first graph, I fundamentally know what's happening with the rest of the graphs. So, great. And what I'll say with small multiples is oftentimes there are many charts that can be turned into small multiples by just adding panels. So for instance, this graph is the exact same data that I just showed you, but it just plots all of the groups on the same visuals. It's all the same information, right? Nothing has changed. But instead, we just have it all on one graph, and we're using color as a visual clue to differentiate the groups. The challenge with this is that it's hard to pick out the trend for any one group, right? It's hard to see what's happening with, the Asian group versus the multiple race group. And what we do when we turn it to small multiples is quickly see those trends, right? We can see that there is a really distinct trend between the white group versus the Hispanic Latinx group. So that's the benefit of small multiples, is sort of making it easy to interpret through all of those panels. But what we're going to do real quick is we're going to shift to a case study looking at two different visual types. And I'll be curious to hear, sort of looking at these two visuals, which chart do you feel tells a clearer story and why? So on the next page, feel free to weigh in on the chat or on audio. The purpose of our chart here is to understand which district has had the biggest change in the number of HIV-positive pregnant women between 2015 and 2016. We have chart A, which is sort of a modified line chart, and then chart B, which is our chart. And yeah, so I'll pause there. Feel free to weigh in on the chat or on audio. Which of these do you think tells a clearer story to answer our purpose? I'd love to hear why people say that. So what's your preference?
This is Marisol from Zero Waste Washington. And for me, I want to say chart B is easiest to read, although there is no legend. I did quickly pick up, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the colored bars represent different years. So it's way easier to compare the years side by side, and then going down by district versus chart A. I really had to look for a lot of the clues, like the years towards the bottom. What does the blue represent? What does the gray represent? And then towards the end of the right-hand side of chart A, there's these numbers which were clear. It's just a little too many puzzles of the puzzle for me to put together versus chart B. I could figure it out a little bit more quickly.
Great, thanks, Marisol. And great call out that there is not a legend on chart B. That is a significant oversight, and definitely one we'd want to add. Yeah, thank you. Great. Okay, so I'm seeing, I think the preference overall is B. Yeah, and I think, with this case study, and I think with most visuals, the answer is there's no singular right answer, right? Part of it is going to be what's easiest for your audience to interpret, what makes the most sense. Because we're comparing essentially sort of two groups, right? 2015 to 2016, the bar chart does work, right? if we wanted, and I think especially when we look at all 5 districts, right, that's helpful to see. If we were trying to tell a story where we said, you know, we only want to see, we really want an answer to which, are there any districts that have increased, right? Or which district increased? Chart A might be a good option too, because it's showing, we really are just calling out District 2 here, right? The one that's increasing, that's blue. So I think there's not really, again, a clear answer here. It is about, as Marisol highlighted, you know, what are the visual cues you're using and what's going to be easiest for your audience to sort of interpret and answer that question, right? Great. Thanks all for the great answers. So we covered some common chart types, and one thing I just want to highlight here is further resources, right? We've talked about what are some common purposes and common questions that we might want to answer. But there oftentimes are a lot of other questions that people might have, right? We talked about the fact that there's a whole range of purposes for data visualization. If you have a different sort of question you want to answer, or if you're interested in using different chart types, one of the best resources that I can recommend is what's called a chart chooser. And a chart chooser is essentially just a compilation of all different types of graphs. And what it asks you is 2 things. So first, what is your question or your purpose, right? And then based on that, it'll give you recommendations of types of charts to use based upon the visual clues that we use. So there's a bunch of really great free chart choosers out there. And if you're interested in sort of going beyond the chart I've talked about today or thinking about different questions to answer, I'd really recommend checking them out. They're sort of a fun, creative thing to explore. So, and again, the slides with this will be sent out so that you'll have access to all these hyperlinks and can just click through and access them yourself. Great. So the last thing we're going to talk about today is sort of formatting. And we're going to talk about 3 big pieces here. So one is going to be color, one is labeling, and the last piece is font. We're going to start by talking about color. And one of the first things we're going to talk about is sort of focusing in on your colors, right? So sticking with key colors and also being intentional with the selection of your color scheme. We also had a great comment in the chat box, I think from Ben, about making sure our visuals are accessible. And when we think about color, that's something we really need to consider as well, right? So we'll talk about a few ways that that shows up in our visuals. Great. So the first thing that we tend to recommend is stick to a few key colors, right? So as we talked about a bit before, we don't want people to be overwhelmed by our visual. Color is one of our key visual clues. And if we have 17 colors, it no longer really tells us where to look, right? So for instance, on the right hand here with the 14 colors, for every single graph, I have to sort of go back and think about, okay, what does red mean? What does green mean? What does this blue mean? Whereas on the left, if we have 4 key colors, we sort of understand the color scheme, right? And the things that are different colors, such as the red declines in profit here, really jump out at us more, right? It tells us sort of where should I be looking. So thinking about less is more. The other question is, how do we pick our colors? And again, there isn't a right answer here, but I often encourage people to think about what's sort of a meaningful color. The flip side of that is we also want to be careful and remember that the interpretation of color is not universal, right? So oftentimes we might default to things like a stoplight color scheme of red, yellow, green to show high, medium, and low. And this color wheel here is just put up to show that it shows basically like 70 odd emotions in 8 different cultures. And you can see that there's not really a pattern to the colors or to the interpretation of color. So this is just a good reminder that when we pick colors to use on our visuals, don't necessarily assume that the interpretation of a single color is going to always be identical in everyone, right? Not everyone's going to interpret red as stop or low or so forth. What that does mean, though, is that when we're thinking about choosing a color that's meaningful, we want to rely on choosing colors that are meaningful to the work you're doing or to the organization, right? So oftentimes this might mean brand colors, right? Something that links the visual to your organization. An easy example of this is, if I told you that both these colors on my screen were from a beverage company, you would probably immediately know who I was talking about, and you would know which beverage company was which, right? So similarly, you want to pick colors that are going to help your readers connect to your work and make the connection to you as an organization or to your purpose. Accessibility is also a key element of choosing a color scheme. And so, as was mentioned in the chat, color blindness is a key element that we want to account for. So color blindness affects about 5 to 10% of the US population, the most common form being red-green color blindness, which means that, for instance, the traffic light color scheme that we mentioned earlier wouldn't be a good fit. You can see on the right, we use the traffic light color scheme, right? And you can see a difference here, right? The visual clue of color is helping us. But when we look on the right, we're looking at what that looks like to someone who's red-green colorblind, and now they're all just sort of different shades of olive. It's not really meaningful. We can't tell what the difference is. We can't tell what the scheme is. So when we choose a color, we want to be careful that we're picking something that's accessible to everybody. If you use Chrome, there's a great simulator that basically lets you test your visuals and turn your computer screen to simulate what that would look like for someone who has different visual impairments. The last piece about accessibility is we want to think about how your visual is going to be presented. So frequently, at least in my work, we'll print copies of reports or handouts of slides for people to take with them. And a lot of times these are in black and white. The challenge is that many color schemes don't translate to black and white. So for instance, this color scheme, which uses the Excel default, once we print it, it looks like this, right? So it's not really possible anymore to tell which lines are which, especially in the middle here where they cross over. It's just sort of a jumble of gray. And so in general, if you know that there's a chance your visual is going to be consumed in a printed form, particularly in black and white, we want to make sure that our colors are also black and white compatible. Great. The other key part of formatting here is labeling to really help interpretation. And while there's 3 bullet points on this slide, really all of your labeling should really be in service to number 3, right? Making sure that our visual is understandable to viewers and that they can interpret it and help answer that question that we've identified, right? For one, this normally means having a title and axes on your chart, right? You might also want to add other labeling such as data labels or a subtitle, and we'll show what that looks like. But again, we want to be careful of overwhelming the audience with information, right? We don't want it to become a wall of text on top of a visual. And then another key element to consider is also what language is appropriate for your audience. So this is the content of your language. Is it too technical? Does it use jargon or abbreviations that people might not know? But it's also thinking about the literal language as well, right? Is your audience going to be more comfortable viewing and interpreting the materials in Spanish or perhaps another language? And I think, especially for those of us who mentioned audiences that are our constituents or our community members, this is a key component, right? Is how can people really access and understand our materials? So just a quick recap of sort of what are the labels on the chart. We have our title. You're pretty much always going to want to have the title in there, and it should really be something that communicates what's in the chart, right? So what's the main takeaway? What's the main content in the graphic? We then have a subtitle. We don't always need this. It's going to depend again. We don't want to overwhelm, but it can be helpful to give sort of further detail. We have our access titles, which in this case tells us what's happening in each bar that we see here, right? And then we can also add data labels if we need. And the data labels are these little numbers that show the percentage in each bar. Sometimes these are useful, particularly if people need the specific value. But sometimes, especially if you have a lot of data, this can get really overwhelming pretty quick. The last piece we, of course, want is our source, right? So where did our data come from? Where did we find it? If somebody wanted to look at it, could they also use it? The key thing here is, again, as we talked about earlier, we don't want to clutter our chart and overwhelm the audience, right? So you might not need data labels if it's evident or if you only have 2 pieces. So, use it sparingly and figure out what's the priority. The last piece, again, is, our end goal is understanding. And so the last thing I'd encourage you to think about with labeling your visuals is how is your audience going to be consuming your visuals and what do they need to interpret it? So for instance, are they comfortable with the visualization and don't need much guidance? Have they used data visualizations a lot before? You might want to consider, are you going to be available to explain it to them? Are you presenting it to them, or are you just handing them a report and then they read through it on their own? Another consideration I like to think of is also, how much time are they going to have to digest this and understand this? So do they have a half hour to look at the visual, or are they only going to have 2 minutes between meetings to glance at it? So depending on your audience and sort of what their needs are and how they're going to be consuming this visual is going to really guide what sort of labeling you need to help them understand it and to understand the visual. Great. The last piece we're going to talk about for formatting here is font. So the two key pieces here is that we want our font size to be logical. So things that are the most important should come first. And then we also, again, want to make it accessible. So we talked about color blindness. Similarly, want to consider other possible visual impairments. So for font, we're just going to look back again at our labeling. And really the goal here is that the largest font should convey the most important piece first. Typically, this is going to mean that your title should be the largest. And then the next most important thing should be the next largest, and so on. Typically, this means that the subtitle's next, followed by the headers, and then followed by the data labels and marks. Great. And then the other thing to think about when selecting a font is that we, again, want to keep in mind accessibility and the ability to engage with this. So for instance, a small font that is low contrast, like gray on white, which I just put on the screen, is very difficult to read, right? A big font that's high contrast, like black on white, is much easier to read for nearly everyone, right? A good rule of thumb is that printed materials should generally be at least minimum 9 point, and presented material should be a minimum of 20. We have a great call out by Ben in the box as well that alternative image captions can also help with visual impairment. Yeah, and so what he means is sort of the like the alt text that we see on images, at least in Excel, or sorry, on PowerPoint, you can customize those based upon your image. And so it's good to have an alt text that describes what's in the visual or what's the takeaway so that people have an alternate option to understand. Yeah. Thanks, Ben. Great. So we're going to do another quick case study, this time looking at formatting. And what I want you to think about as you look at this is, in this visual, what would you change in the formatting to make it more readable? We're visualizing data here that is looking at how adults in Washington to commute to the office. And so take a minute and let me know what you think you would want to be different in the formatting. Feel free to put it in the chat or come off mute again.
This is Marisol again. So something I would do is I would make either the types of transit or the percentages larger text, and then either or the types of driving or the percentages, actually I'll put them inside the box to make it just a little bit more readable. That way I don't have to be looking up and down and looking at similarities of, okay, the drive alone is dark or purple, but then I have to go down to the percentage to see if that's what matches. So either the percentages inside the box or the types of commute type in the box, and then make whichever data is outside the box larger font sized.
Great, good call out. Yeah, so put the labels on the bars. Excellent. I see someone else in the chat noted font size as well. Yep, someone else noted percentages. Cami noted percentages called out, similar to what Marisol was saying. Good. We have a few comments on color. Yeah, not a fan of the color scheme, I'm sensing, Linda and Cami. We also had a proposition for changing the structure. Ben said to change it to a donut chart. Yeah, that'd be another chart type that we could use here, absolutely.
And then I think the other suggestion is to order it by size.
Great call out. Thanks, Chris. And oh yeah, I see. Thanks to Cami, and I think Marcel, you mentioned that as well. So what our revised visual looks like takes into account many of the pieces that you guys suggested. So for instance, we changed the color scheme. We muted it and called out sort of the biggest category with this green and left everything else in a gray, which is both black and white printing friendly as well as colorblind friendly. We changed the titles and made them larger, made them a little more meaningful. And then we did what Marcel was describing, where we took the labels out of the legend and put them directly over the bar along with the percentage. So now you don't have to look from the bar up to the legend, back to the bar. You can immediately see what it is. We also took Cami's suggestion and reordered the data so that the largest group is the first one we see, right? It goes public transit, drive alone, then carpool, so forth. Yeah. So I think this is just a great example of, even with a good structure, a good chart type, adding good formatting practices really changes your visual, right? It can really make it a lot more accessible and easy to use. So this is another quick resource. So there's a really great printable checklist that summarizes sort of a cheat sheet for what formatting you should think about. The list looks long, but I promise it's quick, and it has a really nice checklist set up on the link here. So that will go out in the slides as well. So the last thing we're going to do is we're going to sort of tie this all together, and we're going to do two things. We're going to do sort of a quick case study of visuals of this process from start to end. And then we're also going to talk about what are some of the resources you can use to recreate visuals and do this in your own work. So for our case study, we're just going to do the life of the visual from start to finish, thinking about our framework. So what's our purpose, our content, our structure, our formatting, and of course, who's our audience. So our case study, this is a hypothetical case study that I've revamped some data for. And hypothetically, we've just finished a project that offered parenting and childcare support to families. We need to present the results of our program to donors and county officials. The purpose of this is really to show how often families participated in each of the program activities in the last 12 months. And there's sort of two key program activities that we want to report on. So we want people to really see how did people participate in our program. The content we have is from our program logs. So we kept track of how often people participate in each activity. And we have 4 attendance categories, right? We have people who never attended, people who attended once, people who attended twice, and those who attended 3 or more times. So now we have our purpose and we have our content, and we want to think about our structure here. And what I would argue is that what we're really doing is we're fundamentally comparing different groups, right? We're comparing these different attendance categories. And since we're comparing a group, we want to think about using a bar chart. So we'll start with a bar chart. We have our purpose, we have our bar chart. This is okay, but there's some limits. I think a big one is that you'll notice is there's no title, right? So we don't actually know which program activity this is talking about. The sorting of columns is not really sensical, right? It starts with more than 3 times, then never, then once, then twice. It is sorted by which occurs most frequently, but because of the fact that there's sort of a logical order here, right? Never, once, twice, more than 3 times, we probably want to reorder it. And it's okay, but there's more we could do. So what we're going to do is we're going to add formatting. And to do that, what we did is we ordered those columns in sort of the sensible order of never, once, twice, more than 3 times. We added our subtitle to show that these were people who attended a play group. We added the access labels, number of respondents, and made these bolder. And then we also added the data labels, which show how many people were in each group, right? So how many people attended more than 3 times. And you can see that most people did, 105 people. The one other thing we mentioned, though, is we had 2 program activities, right? One for parents and one for children. This only shows one of them. We actually want to show both of them. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go back to our small multiples. And the reason we can do this is we asked women the same type of question for the 2 program activities. We took attendance logs for the 2 program activities, and there's the same attendance categories for both, right? People either attended never, once, twice, more than 3 times. And so what we did is we just created a small multiple where one panel is one activity, attended a play group, And the other one is the second activity, attended a course. You can see that sort of our final visual from start to finish is, this was our original, this is our revamped one. And this is really to answer our purpose of how often did people participate in our program. So we could share this with our donor and say, this is how often people participated. Most people attended both a class and a play group multiple times. Great. So that was sort of a rapid fire from start to finish. The last sort of question, and I know a number of people mentioned this at the beginning, is what sort of tools do I need to create these visuals myself? And what I would say here is there's a lot of different software you can use to visualize. They don't need to be expensive. They don't need to be hard to use. Some possibilities that I've used in the past are Excel, Google Sheets, and Tableau. There's plenty of others as well, right? There's R, there's, oh my gosh, PowerPoint. There's a lot of options. And I just really want to highlight that all of these can create beautiful visuals, right? So this was one that I created in Excel. This is the same chart in Google Sheets, and this is the same one in Tableau. So this is, all of these visuals can be accessible through a number of different softwares, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer. What I'm going to include here over the next few slides is resources for each of these. So for Excel, Excel has a lot of power to make different graphs. The links I've included here are either specific how-tos for different charts. So for instance, how to do a bar chart, how to do a line chart, as well as some downloadable Excel templates. So they've already created the chart, and then you just have to populate your data into it. You know, again, I think if you're grappling with creating a chart and want assistance, this is another opportunity where King County is a great resource and has the tools to support. Google Sheets, some Google resources. Google also has some really great visuals. This link here shows a summary of all the chart types that they support. So if you click through it, it gives you sort of like a mini chart chooser where they'll show you all the different chart types, as well as a link to a how-to for each of those. Some of the common ones that we talked about here are, again, the line graph, the bar chart, the pie chart as quick links. The last thing I want to highlight is Tableau. If you are interested in using Tableau, you can have a free license through Tableau Public, but the caveat is all your visuals are publicly available. So if you have sensitive data or data that has personal information attached, that's not going to be a good fit. The other thing I want to highlight, particularly as many of you are with social service agencies or nonprofits, is Tableau has a foundation arm called Tableau for Good, which gives free licenses to nonprofits with annual operating budgets under 5 million. So you do essentially have to apply and provide proof that you are a registered nonprofit. And so there is a small administrative fee of about $50, I think. But this then gives you sort of a full license for Tableau and makes it so that your visuals aren't going to be publicly available. So if you have sensitive data or data that has personal names or information, but you are interested in using Tableau, this would be a good one to explore. The last thing is that Tableau does have a ton of training resources online, including free videos. They're also currently, during COVID, offering 90 days of free e-learning. So if that's something you're interested in, it's a great resource that's going to be free for the next 90 days. The e-learnings are not normally free, but their normal how-to videos are. So, great. The last thing I want to say is, as I said, there's a ton of other platforms. There's a lot of different options. There's a website called Chartmaker that sort of pulls together all sorts of how-tos for different visuals for different platforms. So if you use R or you use ArcGIS or something different that we didn't cover today, this is a great resource to click through and sort of figure out, you know, what are some of the other how-tos or resources out there.